My name is Chloe, and this is the Feed or Flow podcast, where you'll find authentic conversations on how to get your period back and restore your metabolism from years of disordered eating, low-calorie diets, and excessive exercise regimes. No trendy diets of celery juice and broccoli sprouts will be found here. Rather, my mission is to teach you balance and how the foods you've most likely cut out of your diet are the very ones that are essential for health. It's time we stop fearing food and embrace all that it can do for us. Food freedom, vivacious health, and a monthly menstrual cycle is possible, and I'm going to show you how to achieve this type of wellness without obsession.
As a scholar of religion, I started seeing religion-related rhetoric everywhere in the food world. People use it in daily conversations. Guilty pleasure, right? A sinful treat, sinfully delicious. A halo top ice cream. The halo, of course, signifying that it is free of the sacrilegious impurity of having too many calories. So you see enough of this stuff, and I started thinking to myself, well, what if I could bring the tools of religious studies to bear on modern dietary culture? And what I found was that a lot of things we recognize as explicitly religious, food taboos, the idea of purity and impurity, all these kinds of things, they were all present, but they were disguised in modern food culture because people don't think, in the sort of secularization of society, people no longer take their food advice from their priest. They no longer take the medical advice from their pastor or whatever. But so instead, they've papered over these kind of explicitly religious ways of thinking about food with scientific rhetoric and jargon, and that's how I started writing about this. I wanted to expose that and just help people to understand, be a little bit more introspective and honest with themselves about the way in which they make their decisions and the kinds of language that's used around them.
Well, it's so interesting, and you just hit on a really good point, how we used to be a part of these like religious communities, and we would have like dietary restrictions as part of that community. I grew up Mormon, so part of the LDS church. I left that religion quite a few years ago, but we couldn't drink coffee, we couldn't smoke, we couldn't do alcohol. There were certain religious restrictions. And it's fascinating now, I feel like, in this day where we are turning more secular, more atheist, as I would say, just a community. We've turned to internet gurus, YouTube gurus to get our health advice.
Yep, absolutely. And there's a way in which in the same sense that religious figures are often quasi-mythical, they exist in the past, they have a kind of a fictionalized aspect to themselves, which is that you only hear about the miracles, right? You only hear the good stuff. There's a way in which social media allows people to do that in real time. And so you get these saint-like figures who seem to have no troubles in their life, their pure goodness, or even in their own kind of curated vulnerability. It's a way of making themselves, that it's avatars of themselves, right? Which is, and avatars itself, a term from religion. And so they're these avatars of humans that then become the version of mythical figures. They're mythical figures, but in real time. And so it's not surprising that we would look to that. We would like that sort of thing. We want to believe that there is that there's sort of a pure path that's clear forward for us, free of troubles, free of suffering, physical and mental, and ethical, actually, all of them, right? So a lot of what goes on with these diets, and I only talk about this a little bit in the Gluten Lie, but I started thinking about it more in my next book about naturalness, is that it's not enough for foods to be good for you mentally and physically. It's now necessary for them also to be good ethically. And so you get these fascinating marketing, right? All it takes is walking into a Whole Foods or whatever, and you'll see that the foods are at once good for you, but also good for some impoverished community somewhere. And I don't mean to say that that's bad, right? Like, it's good to think about animal ethics and laborers' conditions, et cetera, et cetera. But if you stop and think for a second, is it really likely that any single food will be simultaneously good in all possible ways, right? That's holiness, and that's a way of thinking about food that I think is unhealthy and inaccurate.
Well, and that's what drives orthorexia, is this idea of, oh no, I need to eat cleaner and purer. And I remember when I was sort of on this trajectory myself, I had to keep on eliminating stuff. It wasn't good enough for me just to be gluten free. I had to be sugar and dairy free. It wasn't good enough for me to just do that. I had to then be, raw vegan and then fruitarianism. And it just went on and on and on. And I know for myself, I really felt this sense of I'm greater than thou, and I am pure and I'm holy because I haven't touched the sinful pizza over there in the corner. And I think a lot of people in this day and age, we sort of have started to correlate morality with the foods that we eat. Have you seen that?
Absolutely. I mean, it happens with, it's not, I'm not an expert, I'm no psychologist or sociologist, so I always hesitate to pronounce on cultural trends or anything like that. But I know that as a parent, I have an 8-year-old daughter, and the kind of orthorexia is not just with, it's not just with oneself, it's also with your children, right? So I don't know how much parents are imposing this sort of orthorexia on their children, but the idea that your kid couldn't eat a cupcake or can't eat artificial coloring, that somehow, and I get it, right? You want to keep your kid is pure and innocent. You want to keep your kid pure and innocent. But there's a kind of moralization, as you said, that plays into this, right? That somehow you're a bad person if you eat these things or model that kind of behavior for your child. So the purity is in part about staying healthy, but it's also inherently a moral purity, because being healthy is itself a kind of moral imperative in our society, and for understandable reasons, right? We want to be healthy, but it veers very quickly into dangerous territory when you kind of pursue the sort of purity that you're talking about, because it's an endless, as you know, right? And a lot of people who struggle with orthorexia, it's endless. It's an endless journey there, because there is no such thing as purity. That's an impossible ideal, like perfection, and perfectionism easily becomes pathological.
Yeah, and I don't feel like this huge narrative that sort of diet culture has really shouted to us of, like, I don't know, we hear things like sugar is as bad as like smoking a cigarette,
Cigarettes,
things like
yeah.
that. Yeah, I feel like that's a very like common thing. Everything these days and age, I feel like, is as bad as like smoking a cigarette. I feel like this
Sitting is the new smoking.
Yeah, sitting's the new smoking. Eggs also is correlated to smoking cigarettes. How have you seen this sort of narrative? I mean, before I was hopping on with you, I decided to go into my room and I went to my bookshelf and I pulled out all of the books that I could find that had anything to do with health and nutrition. 47. There are 47 books on my bookshelf that I read that has something to do with diet. And I've read plenty more than those books, and I've read every single one of those books from front and back. The countless number of podcasts I've listened to talking about the dangers of sugar and meat and dairy, and I've listened to so many podcasts and read articles and all of that. And I feel like we're just being surrounded by all of this in this day and age. Now, this is something that you write about, so I'd love to hear your just opinions on all these like diet gurus and books that we have. And is it promoting health, or is it kind of making us really confused?
Well, so I'll give you, to go back to the religion thing. One way to think about the shift that's happening, and this is very broad strokes, is that we want to know as human beings what causes pain and suffering. It's very important for us to know how to avoid pain, avoid sickness, for obvious reasons, right? It makes a lot of sense. But once you get away from purely religious explanations, right? So God sent the suffering because you did something wrong, or God sent the suffering because you didn't, or the ancestors sent the suffering, to take classical China, right? Because you didn't honor this particular ancestor. Once those explanations are off the table, then you have to turn to physiological explanations for suffering, lifestyle explanations, whatever it happens to be. And the problem is, we got a lot of the low-hanging fruit. We got smoking. That was great. We figured that out. But people still suffer. They still get sick. They still die. And so now we're at the next stage of the process where you're getting a bunch of people trying to move in and pronounce on very complicated, uncertain factors in our lives, like diet. And we don't deal well with uncertainty. We want certainty. And so I see all of these diet gurus in the same way that you might see prophets who would talk about the future, right? This was not a low hanging fruit. No one knew how to predict the future. So what do? You get a proliferation of people, all of whom are like, here's what's going to happen. Yeah, I know what's going to happen in the future. I'm going to take away your uncertainty. That's the sort of the characteristic example. So you can think about all these diet gurus in a certain way, like prophets. The difference is, and I mean prophets as in people who foretell the future, not people that speak with God. Technical religious distinction, whatever. Everyone understands what I mean by prophets. So the difference is that the science gurus or the non-religious gurus, I'm guessing in all these books, they all use science, right? They're all making scientific claims. There's constantly studies cited. So they're instead of using the mantle of theology, they're using the mantle of science. But they're trying to force science to do what it can't do, which is give you the one true diet to rule them all so that you can never be sick again. And it doesn't exist.
Thanks for listening to this short clip from the Feed or Flow podcast. To listen to the rest of the show, head on over to your favorite podcast app like iTunes or Spotify. If your period has gone MIA, you're going to want to get her back. She's important for your health and misses you dearly. I've created a juicy online course designed to teach you everything I wish I knew about getting my period back, restoring my metabolism, and cultivating a healthy, nourishing relationship with food. The Get Your Flow On course is designed to empower and inspire you to achieve full recovery. Head on over to www.flowwithchlo.com to sign up.